In the period from the late 1870s onward throughout the 1880s, a number of farmers began to arrive on the Great Plains. In this topic, we'll look at the reasons the farmers began to arrive. They had assumed, as I'd mentioned earlier, that the Great Plains were a great American desert, as Horace Greeley had said, that it was inhospitable, but they're soon going to learn otherwise. The first reason I've already mentioned was, of course, the Homestead Act remained on the book and was a great deal, but there are other reasons. Also, the period from 1876 through 1886 just happened to be an unusually wet cycle in the weather. The ground became more moist and new and varied types of vegetation grew. And many immigrants just arrived and they assumed that this is, the way it'd always be. In fact, of course, weather patterns would always keep shifting. And the droughts would return. In the 1880s and 1890s, for example, there was a pretty severe drought, and the Dakotas lost between 50 to 60,000 settlers from 1885 to 1890. And of course, you're probably familiar with the 1930s. The plains were unusually hot and dry, and that was the beginning of the infamous Dust Bowl. But the settlers coming in the late 1870s and 1880s, they didn't know about that, and all they knew was, hey, it's not as dry as people had said. Another reason the farmers came was the invention of the barbed wire. Farmers needed fences to protect their crops, but fences were wood intensive, and wood was scarce on the Great Plains. Barbed wire solved this problem, requiring much less wood. The idea originated from Joseph Glidden, a farmer in 1873 who experimented with a cotton mill from his home. Improvements on the design and new patents followed, and in time, Glidden helped found the Barb Fence Company in DeKalb, Illinois. Another key improvement was the spread of the steel-built plow. Plows with wood or iron frequently broke on the hard plain soil or rusted. But in 1838, John Deere of Illinois invented a steel-built plow that could conquer the hard soil. For decades, however, the cost of steel was too expensive to make the so-called, singing plow or so-called sod buster, and so it wasn't widely used. By the late 1880s and 1870s and the early 1880s, however, improvements in steel production had brought the price of the sod buster down to the point where, most the average Joe farmer could afford it. Many farmers today, of course, are familiar with John Deere's company, which went into the tractor business early in the 20th century and makes the huge agricultural combines today. The invention of new fertilizers and pesticides also helped farmers. Most fertilizers were phosphorus or nitrogen based, while most pesticides utilized a form of arsenic. Scientific farming continued to improve the crop production as well throughout the 20th century. New dry farming techniques and machines helped when times were especially arid. The purpose was to capture and conserve moisture. It often involved seed depth, windbreaks, strip farming, or the spreading of straw and soil to prevent rapid evaporation. By the late 19th century, harvesting crops had greatly improved with new mechanical reapers. In the late 1830s, Virginian Cyrus McCormick had patented a horse-drawn reaper with a wheel frame that constantly cut as the horse walked. By the 1870s, new so-called harvesters would draw the cut stalks upward to a platform where two men could bound them into sheaves. By the 1880s, an automatic knodder tied them together. Other new inventions included a mechanized corn planter in the 1880s. In 1889, Congress created a new cabinet-level department, the Department of Agriculture. The government certainly did what it could to encourage farming. The same year Congress had passed the Homestead Act, 1862, it had also passed the Morrill Land Grant Act. This law originally provided each state 30,000 acres of federal land for each of its members in Congress. The land was to be used to create new land-grant colleges specifically to train in agriculture and mechanics. By the late 19th century, these newly established colleges had greatly increased the science and mechanics of farming. A follow-up to the Homestead Act was the Timber Culture Act of 1873. In it, Congress allotted a homesteader an additional 160 acres of land in return for planting and cultivating 40 acres of trees. It was obviously an attempt to make the grass-dominated Great Plains more amenable. Because residence wasn't required and because tree planting couldn't be assessed for at least 13 years, speculators filed for several claims at once, then turned around and sold the land at a profit without planting a single tree. When Reconstruction ended in the South in 1876 and the climate for African Americans deteriorated there, many blacks who could fled from the South to the plains, often referred to as, quote, exodusters. On the plains, they established black-dominated towns, the most famous being Nicodemus, Kansas. Kansas had a population of 40,000 blacks by 1880, by far the largest black concentration in the West outside of Texas. As an aside, one can also see the government's interest in settling the Great Plains and the Mountain West by the establishment of the Yellowstone National Park in 1872. With almost 3,500 acres and known for its many geothermal features, including Old Faithful Geyser, Yellowstone was signed into law by President Grant and is often referred to as the first national park in the world. In any event, such parks and such government interest and all the other reasons that mentioned in this section are the reasons that the farmers began to flood onto the plains. This concludes the section on why the farmers came to the plains.